Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm here again with Noah on podcast number 14. If you want to say hi, Noah.
Hello, everyone.
So, today on our podcast, we're going to be talking about Spartan Jameson Locke. And I am fresh off of watching Halo Nightfall again. So, this is a really interesting podcast now that I've had a nice revision of Spartan Locke's character, at least in the way that they were originally going to personify him and how they were going to make him out to be. But before I get into that stuff, Noah, if you want to take it away and kind of give us some history with Spartan Locke and his, what happens prior to his introduction in Nightfall.
Yeah, so Locke was actually born on the colony of Jericho 7 in 2529, I believe, and he was actually orphaned during glassing of the planet in 2535. And so that already gives you a rather interesting backstory to this character, having that perspective and, also going into Halo 5 with, the missions on Meridian and such. And so after that, Locke was placed into orphanage and with a bunch of other kids who had experienced this sort of similar fate with the Covenant War. And so eventually he enlisted with the UNSC. He wanted to take revenge for the damage that the Covenant had done, but at the same time he still kind of had some blame for the UNSC's failure to actually defend his world, and so as a result of that he harbored some of that resentment towards the government, the UEG, and the UNSC. Eventually he became a freelance tracker and an assassin, and his behavior and his questionable allegiances allowed him to catch the attention of ONI, or the Office of Naval Intelligence, and they eventually planned on training him for a greater purpose in the organization, and so he accepted the offer, which led to him, training, becoming a better agent, and eventually becoming one of ONI's top operatives, serving as a Section 3 acquisition specialist. And so with that, he eventually was assigned to targeting Del Vidami, or the Arbiter, of course, and so that leads us to the attacks on Cedra.
So, with the attacks on Cedra, and after, as you were saying, completing the target profile dossier on Thel Vadami or Vidame, however you want to say that, on February 7th, 2556, there was an attack on Cedra by an elite zealot. Now, during this time in which you're introduced to Nightfall, there's a quick opening scroll that kind of shows that the end of Halo 3 and their peace treaty between humanity and the Covenant is supposed to be currently underway, and that there is not supposed to be any sort of underneath the table things going on. And obviously, as we know with Oni and the history of Oni throughout the Halo universe, that's not always necessarily the case. So on February 7th, 2556, Locke leads an Oni team that's dispatched to the distant colony of Cedra. Now, Cedra is what they call a backwater colony, where it's really far out, and the UNSC during the time of the Human Covenant War receded from it very quickly and kind of instigated a very sort of malicious intent between the humans who were still on Cedra on that colony, or at least the survivors, and the UNSC. They're not very happy with that, much similar to other colonies that have also taken place within the Halo universe where the same thing occurred. To start this off, a human zealot is receiving pretty much it's a refrigerated object, and it's unknown to start off with. This ends up becoming a bioweapon, and he receives it from a smuggler named Axel. During the investigation, they find out that the bioweapon, which ends up going off in the middle of the city on Cedra, is actually from the Alpha Shard of Halo. Now, during the explosion of the Installation 04A, or Alpha Halo, many of the pieces were sent through slipspace, and due to the fusion and fission reactions of the Pillar of Autumn, new elements could be created that would be unlike anything they'd ever seen before. So the element that is used to create this bioweapon, which if you watch Halo Nightfall, I don't want to get too much into spoiling it here, with the element that's used to create it, it only comes from this singular ring piece due to the circumstances under which it was created. This then begins a mission to the Alpha Shard of Halo, Alpha Halo Installation 04, and Locke's introduction with not only his team, but to another character who is later revealed to be a former Spartan, 037 Randall. And throughout their mission at the Alpha Halo, Locke, his team, and Randall's team with the Cedra Guard, is who I believe they're called, actually run into Legolo, is what they're called, or Magalet Golo, I believe is the way you pronounce that. And the Magalet Golo on the ring are not very fond of any technology and therefore begin the attacks. During their mission, Spartan at this time, Agent Locke and his team run into the smugglers who were actually harvesting the element, and they reveal that the technology is what's causing the hunter worms to attack them. So throughout the rest of this, Spartan Locke and his character really starts getting fleshed out and developed here. Unlike a lot of what we see in Halo 5, where Locke is kind of just thrown in and kills the leader of a Covenant faction, Jul 'Mdama, who hopefully we'll be doing a podcast here for very soon. He actually is very developed throughout Nightfall. Unlike a lot of Oni, you would say soldiers or Oni agents, Locke is unlike anything that we've seen, at least with those people. If you've ever gone into the Halo extended lore or media or anything like that, you would know that many of the Oni soldiers or individuals within their ranks, whether they're soldiers or civilians, are morally questionable, to say the least. Probably the most of which, Noah, you and I have talked about with Dr. Halsey and, creating the Spartan 2s and whatnot. So Locke is kind of going against the grain in that sense. And throughout their time on this mission on the Alpha Shard, many of the soldiers, both the Cedra units and Locke's crew, are picked off through a whole bunch of means that it really makes Nightfall, after watching it again, very, very good. And Locke's character of being a human being and not having that sort of moral questionability that so many other Oni agents do kind of comes out. And Spartan Randall, who is, at the time isn't known that he was formerly a Spartan, however, shows the augmentation scarring of both having the augmentations and having them being removed. Recognizes kind of these qualities with Spartan Locke, and in order to kind of preserve yet, not totally give away an obvious ending, Locke does survive, but it really sets up a good example for how this character could be introduced to the Halo universe. And I feel very bad that as we move on to what soon here will be Halo 5 and whatnot with this podcast and talking about the events that occur with him in this podcast, he really seemed like he was a very good character to be introduced. And for any of you who have seen the Halo 2 anniversary snippet right before booting up the first level of Halo 2, you would actually see the kind of teaser that we were given, where I believe they were even using the same voice actor, if I'm correct. They hadn't switched over to the new voice actor. It was the exact same Locke, the exact same character, and it seemed like it was going to fit and transition very well. And it was the kind of person that they had set up. Unfortunately, though, that's not what we had. But before we get to Halo 5, Noah, do you want to talk a little bit about his, transition into becoming a Spartan 4?
So, right after the events of Nightfall, obviously Locke gained a lot of notoriety and was really set himself apart from the rest of the Oni agents. And so, eventually in 2556, Locke was actually selected to become a Spartan 4. And so after undergoing all of the normal augmentation procedures and such, he was eventually tasked with a lot of missions that were all throughout the outer colonies, and he was usually working, on his own without support, and he really earned himself a reputation for being, successful in all of these missions. And eventually he started partaking in a lot of lower profile operations like Operation Delphi, Operation Mad Hatter, Operation Dawn Eclipse, and even Operation Eastern Azure. All of these were really important to UNSC plans within the outer colonies and just messing with Covenant activity and all sorts of different things. And so eventually, by I believe it's October of 2558, he was assigned to be the leader of this new Spartan Fireteam Osiris, which was of course comprised of himself, Olympia Vale, Edward Buck, and Holly Tanaka, And so, with that, and the creation of this brand new fire team that was meant for carrying out these difficult and complex missions, we are led into the events of Halo 5, if you want to take it away from there.
As we enter or introduced to Locke in Halo 5, obviously with what I like to say is probably one of my favorite cutscenes in Halo 5 is that opening cutscene where Spartan Team Osiris is being briefed on, or by both Captain Lasky and Commander Palmer about, Dr. Halsey and what's going on Kamchatka, as well as that Julam Dama is there. It really is a nice thing to see that they started off Halo 5, kind of similar to with Halo 2, where they told us beforehand that they were going to introduce a new character in Halo 5 who was going to be a main character and have him be there. So to see that kind of starting off cutscene, I believe you have even said to me before, you kind of felt like it was a little over the top, but at the same time, it was kind of what I felt like they needed in order to give a little bit more anticipation and a little more insight to Locke as a character, to show that he's not just a pushover, he's not just another Spartan, for those people who haven't read any of the extended media or maybe hadn't seen Halo Nightfall prior to that. So going kind of into that, what do you then think about like the over the topness of that? I mean, it's kind of hard to make a transition from Nightfall or the extended media into games, and you and I have talked a number of times before about the extended media of Halo being extremely well written, amazing and working out very well. Yet, obviously with Halo 5, and Halo 5's been around for 5 years now, that's the last thing that we've really seen short of Halo Wars 2 with the writing in an FPS game. So what do you think about that? Like with it, should it have been over the top? Should it have been a better way to introduce a character like Locke into it for those who hadn't read the media?
Yeah, so I definitely agree that it was, at least the beginning was well done. It had a lot of cinematic qualities. Going back and watching it, I just remember on opening night watching that cutscene and thinking, okay, this might be something special. There's a chance there's something good here. Of course, it all spiraled downhill after, but that's a different story. But I think the only part that kind of took me out of it was the just the part at the end where they're all kind of barreling through an entire Covenant army just by themselves. But I do understand the point of that cutscene in the sense, because if you watch it carefully, what you'll notice is that what 343 was doing with that cutscene was they're demonstrating all of the new Spartan abilities to you. You'll see sprinting, you'll see them doing a ground pound, a Spartan charge, all these different they were just showing it off in a different way, and I can appreciate the effort, but I'm not too much of a fan of the execution on that particular part. I think the lead up to that cutscene, the light is green part, all of that stuff was really well done, and honestly, Fireteam's Osiris's motif that was written up for this particular game was really, really enjoyable to listen to. So, all of that, it was a mixed bag, I would say.
Then yeah, I guess going on from there with the rest of the Battle of Kamchatka, I mean, we're introduced to Locke and we get a feel for what Halo 5 is going to be like with this new, more squad style gameplay where you're not as really strong as you normally are in a Halo game, or at least with shields and health wise. And what I found nice about Halo 5 at least was that you're kind of able to order your squad around to do stuff. It reminded me a lot of the game Star Wars Republic Commando, if you've ever played that. And that game was a jewel in its own. And so from here, being able to be Chief or Locke or anything like that, it felt really nice. It felt like it was an ability to have smart AI go and take, either not positions, but vehicles or weapons, or do certain things or focus on certain targets. So I like the direction they were going with that, and having Locke as a leader who had already demonstrated, whether it was the time during, with Oni Section 3 as an agent, or whether it was with Nightfall, where he showed that even his moral standing is really well, was a good lineup for what the rest of the game and what the Hunt the Truth campaign, which is also a huge thing. I really hope we get to do a podcast on, because that was an amazing audio series on its own. And yeah, so being able to kind of follow through with Hunt the Truth and all of that, and seeing how Locke was going to come up with these moral decisions of how he was going to tackle Chief with what happens in Halo 5 was going to be just really, for me, it was an amazing idea and concept throughout Halo lore, and currently where the universe was at when Halo 5 was being released. But as we know, we finally get to the end of the first level, or Fireteam Osiris, and we see Fireteam Osiris engage with Julam Dama and his squad, or his group that was there with him. And I mean, while it is nice to see that, with especially characters like Buck and now Locke being able to, kind of mow through Covenant, I would say that it really kind of qualifies almost as an over the top like it did before. I mean, Julam Dama is, again, another thing that we want to talk about in our podcasts. And he had been there throughout all of Halo 4 Spartan Ops and actually has some great writing and, was a very prevalent character in the extended media. But, in the time that we're there, we get a 30-second cutscene where Locke, pretty much just assassinates him and kills him. And I mean, he also makes it look absolutely effortless. So to kind of see that there was no struggle at all there and that Locke simply just did it, again, I kind of feel like we're again on the over the top of introducing Locke's character, and kind of just throwing him into a situation where anyone who hadn't seen him prior to Halo 5 is now just going to have to, the threat level and, we say like the power level, if you're watching like Dragon Ball Z or whatever, of Locke is already above people. And the way they did it was by throwing characters that had already had established backgrounds and had already gone through a lot of complex things in the universe, were kind of felt like thrown under the bus and, weren't able to be expanded on, due to the fact that they needed Locke to be, a more prevalent character. But unfortunately, that rolls over, and we get to Halo 5 and the incidences where we're talking about Cortana and whatnot, and go through Blue Team, and this then kind of transitions then to the hunt for Chief on Meridian and what's going on there. And so before we really kind of get to St. Helios, and I know that that's your favorite part, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about this, because this is where we see not only Fireteam Osiris encounter Warden Eternal, which is kind of like their first big boss, like their first big challenge that they have to deal with, but is also where Locke has a one-on-one fight with Chief. And I'm not going to sit here and I'm not going to bash the whole thing over and over again. I mean, there have been multiple YouTube videos and whatnot about that, but what do you kind of think about that engagement with Chief and everything that had happened?
It's sort of a weird mix between there was some promise there, but again, it's just the execution fell flat. I think one of the criticisms that a lot of people pointed out that I really enjoyed was the fact that, that whole sort of chase down that leads up to this fight, where there's Fireteam Osiris running on the platforms and then Blue Team on the other side. That could have been an interesting gameplay segment, but instead we're given this cutscene, which is, again, disappointing, one of the many disappointing decisions in Halo 5. But in regards to the fight itself, there's some interesting bits of, just lore-accurate stuff in there. Like, you'll see how Locke has to utilize his thrusters to land hits on Chief that actually would affect him, and then the fact that whenever Chief goes in for the punch on the ground, if that would have hit, that would have been in for Locke, and just interesting stuff like that. But at the same time, it just was kind of, it just wasn't that well choreographed, I guess is the way to say that. It wasn't as intense as people would have wanted, because, this was what was hyped up for, this was supposed to be the moment of Halo 5 in a sense.
Yeah, like this was the hunt the truth, like advertising point, was that Locke and Chief are going to go at it at some point, and this is right where it started.
And we don't really, I mean, this was it for that, after this, they're friends pretty much. Of course, there's some events that go into that, but I mean, it could have been a lot more, and it definitely had room to be a much better, well done fight scene.
Well, I know that like one of the things that you and I kind of both enjoy about Halo 5, and one thing that I would say a kind of mixed feelings on, is the mocap, or the motion capture, that we've talked about before in the podcast, where the individuals who are there are the stunt people are choreographed throughout the fight or throughout whatever cutscene, and their motion is captured with their face and their body and whatnot. In here, I don't know if that necessarily helped very well, because I believe this scene was mocapped and it just felt very slow. And I know that there have been other YouTubers out there like Installation00 who have said, well, this is this is happening in Spartan time, and so you need to understand, like, you're viewing it in like the speed at which they are able to see what's going on. And while I do like that explanation, and I guess it kind of puts a pretty good band-aid over what's going on, the fact is that a lot of people, especially newcomers to the Halo franchise who have played Halo 5 to start with, it really doesn't work for them, because they need to be able to see how cool all this stuff is. They need to be able to be demonstrated how fast it is. And with how the extended universe and lore, like you were saying, certain things like Locke having to use his thrusters for punches and kicks, and Chief, that hit that he hits on the ground that would have finished Locke, had it followed through, would have been the end. It is, Halo is made in such a way that you can make awesome choreographed cutscenes. They have the tools there. Unfortunately, it just seemed like with that they didn't do very well on it, and it kind of led to a disappointing role. But before we get to the point, like you were saying, where Locke and Locke and Blue Team, or Fireteam Osiris and Blue Team are now I guess on the same side, so to speak, or going towards the same goal. There is a good segment of Halo 5 that I think Locke does very well, and that's his introduction to the Arbiter and the mission on St. Helios. And that's also, from what I understand, is your favorite part of Halo 5. If you wanted to go on and talk about that, man, you have the floor.
So essentially, if you would have just kind of taken out the St. Helios arc of Halo 5, and then, encompassing the missions like Swords of St. Helios as well, and culminating with the Battle of Sinion, I would have thoroughly enjoyed that little slice as a just basically mini spin-off game, because there's a lot of good stuff there. It's a lot of fun stuff happening. And I think Arbiter's character was given justice as well. He doesn't act out of place like some of the other recurring characters do. On top of that, he has a really cool-ass armor design too, but that's a different story. Anyways, so essentially we see that the Fireteam Osiris is ordered to St. Helios, which is, of course, under Civil War. And so, you have to deny that the operation took place, just because the UNSC can't really take sides in this sort of thing. And so eventually we see that, on St. Helios, I just want to point that out, that this is the first time we're actually on that St. Helios homeworld, this fabled place that gave birth to this race of warrior aliens that we love so much. And the areas that they built really do it justice, as well as the music in this scene. And going forward and just into the like the Temple of the Elders and all that, the Elder Council chamber, sorry. And so eventually we see that the Arbiter is trapped by some of the invading forces in this Elder Council chamber, and so we have to go and rescue him, essentially. And once you arrive there, you can see that he sort of had it under control. He would have probably managed well, but of course Locke arrives, and then eventually, after they get a little confrontation, in the sense where Arbiter was well aware of the fact that Locke was eventually was assigned to assassinate him, and so he kind of gives him that talk, and they share a decent moment of sort of mutual respect, in a sense. But eventually we see that the Forerunner constructor, which would allow them to activate the Guardian so that way they could track down Master Chief, is somewhere there. But before we get to that constructor, we have to deal with this Kraken that we were introduced to on, I believe, Kamchatka, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this looming threat of the Kraken is finally resolved, which is again one of those points of Halo 5 that is unfortunately a wonderful concept, but just terrible in execution, because the Kraken fight could have been something that rivaled, fighting scarabs in previous Halo games. However, we're given something that's rather simple and unfortunately lackluster, just due to the fact that the Kraken is just sort of there. It's more of a set piece than a fully fledged enemy sort of thing. And so eventually you destroy the Kraken, and that gives room for, Arbiter's forces to attack Sinion, which is the next step where the Guardian is actually located.
And this is like one of the best pieces of Halo 5 for me, because this is what they actually showed at the E3 trailer as well. I mean,
yeah, it is.
Yeah, there were some adjustments, but what we saw on the E3 trailer was pretty much exactly what we had. I mean, there were some lighting differences and things like that, but it was a really good piece where it was like, wow, this feels like it's on par with how the books and extended media and things like that have described it, and a lot of it makes sense, to what's going on and how it's working. And that part of Halo 5, I felt, did the most justice to what's been written before, and where 343 is, I guess, is having to deal with, and then going forward towards the future. But then I guess finishing that up, then we see the rest of the battle of Sinion and whatnot, and then we're kind of thrown into the incident where Locke makes it onto the Guardian, and they eventually make it to Genesis and whatnot. But we kind of get then towards the end of Halo 5, and I on the level Guardians, where Cortana's kind of interrogating and having a back and forth, audio, or I guess over the radio confrontation with some of the members of Fireteam Osiris. It really didn't feel like there was enough there to flesh out any sort of real issues that were going on. Like, we don't know enough information about a lot of the characters, and especially with Locke, the outside of Nightfall and his good moral compass that we learn that he has in that movie, or at least that short film, and the other characters like Holly Tanaka, and then Spartan Vale as well. All we really know a lot about some of those characters are extended media and whatnot, and their ability that they were be able to be fleshed out in Halo 5. It just really didn't feel like they came in. And so you'll notice that I left out one particular character, because I mean, Spartan Buck, who is a Spartan now, is actually very fleshed out. I mean, he has a whole pretty much game before that, as well as two books, New Blood and Bad Blood, that are also out as well. So then what do you think then, as we get towards the end of Halo 5, Spartan Locke's character as a whole could have been done, not just going to say better, but still needs to be done in order for him to be, I guess, a respected character? Because I feel like is a major issue with Spartan Locke, is that he's not a respected character within the Halo universe. What do you feel like then that could be done, or that could have been done within the realm of Halo 5? Not looking, I guess, too forward now towards Infinite, but that could have been done a little bit differently to make him better.
I think one of the main things, I know we've talked about this on the Discord and all that, but removing the whole Halo 5 thing, and just, instead of trying to make this a mainline Halo game, just taking the time, making this a spin-off game dedicated to Osiris, so that way we are familiar with these characters, they're given time to grow, and then you can introduce them into the main story with another Halo game later on. But what we got was this sort of forced effort to just jumble in all these different characters without any introductions. They essentially tried to take, the most recent Avengers movies type of approach to it and just shove all these characters. But, what those Avengers movies have going for them is there's significant amounts of backstory to these characters before they're thrown into this giant compilation set. And so what Locke really needed was just straight up more development time. He just needed time to become more of a character, and, like you were saying, become more consistent with what I guess the original vision was. And I think a lot of the issues with Locke too is the fact that his actor Mike Coulter eventually couldn't fulfill his contract, I guess, just because of the fact that he had to go on and do Luke Cage on Netflix, which was probably something that might have affected, I don't know for sure if this affected the process, but having to switch from Mike Coulter to I believe it was Ike Amadi who did the voice for Locke. Just because, like you were saying, if you look at the Locke in Nightfall and then you look at the Locke that we were given in Halo 5, it's very different. And a lot of people, myself included, and I know you said you would probably have preferred to see what the original vision for Locke was and see that version of Locke delivered by Mike Coulter. And so forever, Locke will be that character that just could have been something great, but instead was just a massive letdown. And I think the only thing that could really be done is just expanding on his lore, giving him time to grow as an individual, instead of trying to develop, the entirety of Fireteam Osiris and Locke all at once.
Going off that, like you're saying, we know Buck has had all of ODST, and I referenced that a little bit before, but kind of even talking about the other members of Fireteam Osiris and what I kind of touched on before, in game time, which there are plenty of individuals, Halo fans, that only play the games, that aren't so into Halo lore like we are, there was literally no development time for Locke, as you're saying. There's no development time for Vale or Holly Tanaka, and so it just really, I felt like shortchanged a lot of those characters. And like you're saying, they did a very good, a very similar, I should say, Avengers approach where they kind of threw a lot of people together before being able to go out and flesh into it, because there were, there's a whole nother Spartan team, blue team, that has had books and whatnot written on them and everything, but their first appearance in game was also in the same game. So it really did feel like that for anyone who hadn't seen all these other extra characters and whatnot and hadn't known anything besides Chief, there was a lot going on here. And to make it, better, I would say, or to make it different, what could have been done different was, yeah, what we talked about in the Discord and what I was going to bring up, where had 343 kind of stuck to the title Halo Guardians and not put a 5 on there, and maybe just included not necessarily snippets of playing as Chief, but snippets where you were able to see Chief. That would have been a very different approach, where the whole game would have been Locke's and Fireteam Osiris's introduction, rather than having to kind of tie in all of Halo 5 and what happened with Cortana and whatnot. It could have been much closer to Hunt the Truth, where the galaxy is still in this state of perpetual unknown of what's going on in the outer colonies. Could have developed a lot more of the issue and the malicious fighting that kind of goes on between the insurrectionists. They could have explored that in the UNSC, and why in Halo 5 Locke understands and is so sympathetic and kind of takes shit from a lot of the people on Meridian when you're there, because he understands exactly what it's like. And unless you go deep and like are looking for reasons why this stuff's going on, you'll definitely end up missing it. And so hopefully here in the future, which is what we like to talk about here at the end, we'll see more development with a lot of Fireteam Osiris, and not just Locke. I mean, Locke is definitely the number one character if I was 343 who I would be trying to turn around the player or fans perspective of, because if he is going to be an important character, you want people to like him, and you don't really want him to turn into kind of like a Commander Palmer, which I know many fans aren't very fond of. But not only with him, I mean, Buck is, and I'll let you talk about Buck a little bit, and we've talked about Alpha 9 and whatnot already, but Buck has been expanded on plenty already. There's he has in-game time, he has lore time, and expansion in many respects. But to make also the other members of Fireteam Osiris kind of not just disappear would be nice as well, because then they would, like, with the book Bad Blood compared to New Blood, where we see some differences in opinion on certain characters, which I don't want to spoil. And just because the writer from New Blood understood what things were wrong, got a better picture of the Halo universe, and then was able to kind of compensate for that in the new book, so that people felt a lot better about all of the situations and whatnot that were going on. So then, Noah, what do you think that, looking towards the future now, can happen with Locke? Can happen with maybe even Fireteam Osiris or even Blue Team as well?
Based on the fact that 343 kind of wrote themselves into a corner with that, the fact that these characters were in the front lines and they were so important to the story, you can't really just get rid of them. I mean, you could, but it's just pretty lazy writing, in my opinion, if you just try and get rid of them. Instead, what they should do is figure out. I think the main thing that they did wrong was essentially they took the approach with Buck, which is he was a known quantity. People understood who he was and what he did based on ODST. So they just took that same approach where they just assumed all these characters were known quantities since there was some outside lore media, and just said, okay, take these guys and have fun with them or whatever. What they should have done instead was just assume that everybody playing was unfamiliar with these characters and just giving them that time to shine. And honestly, I think if necessary, which it probably was, Halo 5 should have been a much longer game, just because so much had to
I mean,
happen.
there were like 3 levels in there that were just like quick back to back. Like they felt like they were just cutscenes and walking through.
Yeah, those walking missions, which again, I wasn't a fan of them in execution, but again, in concept, those walking missions could have been fun. They could have been ways for people who are like me and you, who want to get deeper into the lore, to just explore and just immerse ourselves within the world of Halo. But instead, all you got was just a couple little Easter eggs here and there, and then just go to the objective and do it, which just was disappointing, of course. And so these were barely even missions, but they were considered full missions within, on the menu you can select those missions. But yeah, the campaign just wasn't long enough, and I think they really should have taken a much longer approach, and it would have potentially given them time to flesh out these characters, just because without that story, without a reason to care about them, it's hard to enjoy the main story of Halo 5 just because they're so hollow, they're just, for a lot of time, they're just there. We barely learn much about them. They barely have their opportunity to shine. And it's just sort of a messy approach to what was there. And so what do you think? Do you think they should take time to expand on these characters or just kind of shelve them?
I definitely hope that they don't kind of shy away from the challenge. I know it can be really intimidating, but if they're going to, like they said with Halo 5, and as I said earlier, include a new character like Spartan Locke and, say that he's a main character and they're going to try to put him on a level that is, if not equivalent to, but, then very close to other Spartans and things like that. Kind of the Spartan is not just kind of a joke rank, and with the Spartan 4s, I know a lot of people aren't necessarily big fans of them, but they, in order to make those Spartans better and to make them, considered a higher power level, that they need to kind of differentiate them as well as Spartan 2s and whatnot in their respects. I mean, they need to dive in deeper into this stuff and not be afraid to, face a challenge like riding themselves out of a corner. I mean, there is a lot that's kind of expected here from Halo Infinite, and I really feel like that after Halo 5, with all we don't even know what happened with Halo 5, and you can't really talk about much of anything that's included in Halo 5 without talking about kind of the game itself as a whole, like we did here, and how, I want to say bad it was, but how, poorly certain things were executed, like you've said a number of times. So it really, really sucks. I hope that 343 looks at it, takes kind of a page from their own book and looks at the extended media and says, there are ways to write things about Halo very well, and decides to go about it with tackling the history, fleshing out these characters more, especially Locke, in the way that they originally designed him. And for any future campaigns, whether they're, teaser trailers like Hunt the Truth, or I would say it's the two sides to every story trailer, or the Audible, whole campaign that they had with Hunt the Truth, both of which were amazing, and they seemed like they were going to create a very, very interesting game that they can follow through with that. They can do it really well, and I really hope they do. Well, that's going to kind of bring us down over here to the end. Noah, if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about, possibly future, anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to touch on real quick?
I think that about covers it.
All right, well, thank you guys very much for tuning in to this episode. I really hope you guys enjoy. Please remember to like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. These podcasts are also on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and SoundCloud if you guys are interested. Also, feel free to check the link in the description for the Discord. There, a lot of the topics that we're talking about we actually cover and kind of go into within our Discord. So if you guys are interested, feel free to join that and come on and chat with us. We're always online and able to help. But thank you guys again for watching, and we'll see you next time.